Back on our special one-hour newsmaker, I'm Brian O'Neill, and now we're going back to the year 1983, October 21st, 1983, for an interview that Kevin Doran did that day with Arnaud deBourgrave, the Newsweek magazine editor. And you don't have to listen too hard to realize that the whole topic of Russia was very big in October of 1983, as well as the rest of the decade.
And many of you, I'm sure, have read either his books or his columns when he was with Newsweek. Arnaud deBourgrave was a senior editor for Newsweek and also a chief foreign correspondent for Newsweek. He has written 2 books in association with others. One called The Spike came out a few years back, and there is a new one out now called Monimbo. Both of them deal with the same basic subject, and that is the enormous influence, according to Mr. deBourgrave, of the Russian KGB in the American media and in the media in the Western world. So, Mr. deBourgrave, it's a real privilege to have you on the program.
Kevin, delighted to be with you.
Mr. deBourgrave, you were with Newsweek, and as I understand it, it was while you were there in a position of considerable influence that you came upon this, what you call the spike, the KGB influence. Can you tell us about that?
Well, I don't know if you can attribute it directly to the KGB. It's certainly part of a mindset that winds up by being tantamount to thought control. It's a sort of no enemies on the left syndrome. And through very clever manipulation, disinformation operations over the years, the KGB has helped produce this mindset. And this was not only documented in The Spike, the first book I did with Robert Moss in 1980, but is now documented in a non-fiction version of The Spike, written by the most important editor in France, who was editor of the Time magazine of France called Express for almost a decade. And the book will be published in the United States under the title of How Democracies Die, which has been on the bestseller list for 23 weeks in France. And Jean-François Revel, the editor in question, documents how Soviet disinformation operations, conducted either directly or through their proxies inside the Western media, have gradually paralyzed any means Western democracies may have to react.
That's a very strong statement, and I know you believe it. I've seen you on television, but I also know that a number of liberal commentators simply throw up their arms and say that that's a fantastic charge.
Well, Mr. Jean-François Revel happens to be a man of the left and a lifelong socialist, so when his book comes out in January, let them shrug all they want. If they want to shrug themselves into an early grave, that is their problem, not mine.
Mr. deBourgrave, in The Spike, you don't name names, but many people came away convinced you were talking about newspapers in Washington and in New York, and even members of the American government at the highest levels. Now, how would you describe The Spike? Is it close to fact, or is it fact under fiction to keep you out of the law courts?
Like its sequel, Monimbo, which is currently on the bestseller list, has a very large factual basis. In fact, Judge Webster, the director of the FBI, who is also a liberal civil rights judge from Alabama, appointed by Jimmy Carter to run the FBI for 10 years, has described Monimbo as devastatingly accurate. As for The Spike, which came out 3 years ago, and which deals with a little understood but tremendously important aspect of Soviet intelligence operations inside the Western media, known in Russian as the Department of Dezinformatia, that is Service A of the KGB. As for that book, I can tell you that every Soviet defector who has worked for the KGB or the GRU, which is Soviet military intelligence, has said that The Spike understated the problem. And when Stanislav Levchenko, the latest KGB defector, and the only one who has ever defected to this country who worked directly for Service A, and ran disinformation operations out of Tokyo for 5 years, Stanislav Levchenko also says that The Spike understated the problem and has testified before the House Select Committee on Intelligence, July 12 and 13 of last year, testimony which was released with many other documents on December 9th of last year to the media, and not one word appeared in the media, even though there were examples of dozens of forgeries manufactured by the disinformation department of the KGB and its proxy services that have duly appeared in our media as fact. So how can liberals tell you that it doesn't go on? No amount of liberal outrage can detract from the fact that disinformation is absolutely central to Soviet strategy for defeating the main enemy, that is what they call us, without having to fight a war.
Can you give us some examples of disinformation that was substantiated, for example, by his testimony?
Well, there were, as I say, in the 330 pages released to the media on December 9th of last year, there were scores of examples. But the biggest theme, if you will, rather than specific examples of forgeries of presidential telegrams or State Department papers or U.S. Army training manuals, all of those have indeed been forged. They take the original and then they change 2 or 3 key paragraphs so that it has a tremendous degree of authenticity. These are very clever forgeries, but insofar as the overall themes are concerned, take détente, for instance. They even managed to disinform Jimmy Carter. When I was in Afghanistan covering the Soviet invasion in late 79 and early 80, before the Soviets kicked us all out, we used to listen on the Voice of America to the President of the United States saying that he had learned more about Soviet intentions in 2 days than he'd realized during the rest of his term in the White House. That, of course, scared the hell out of our allies. But again, it was a function of how successfully even a man like Jimmy Carter had been disinformed. Ed Muskie, I remember listening to him on the Voice of America saying that the invasion of Afghanistan had shattered 12 years of détente. Well, you sort of wonder what kind of Mickey Mouse world they'd been living in, because the Soviets themselves had defined détente. If only you took the trouble to read their theoretical journals in 1972, at the height of so-called détente, when President Nixon signed 29 bilateral agreements with the Soviet Union, including the Space Rendezvous program, which was a huge technological ripoff. At that particular time, 1972, Soviet theoretical journals were saying that détente, which they call peaceful coexistence, is a shift in the global correlation of forces favorable to the Soviet Union, backed and to be made irreversible by the growing power and might of the Soviet Union. That was in Soviet theoretical journals, which, of course, very few people bother to read.
Mr. deBourgrave, I think a lot of us are concerned that perhaps what we read in the papers and watch on television is, in fact, very often influenced by what the Russians want us to believe.
Well, there's no question about it. Their latest secret weapon, who is, in my judgment, worth at least 100 ICBMs, is Vladimir Posner, who is introduced to millions of Americans on Nightline or the McNeil-Lehrer Show Report or many other programs as a Soviet commentator. Well, that, of course, immediately indicates that he has some independence of judgment, not to you or me, but to an average uninformed American. He is no such thing. He is an agent of the state. He spends 3 or 4 hours with his superiors before going on Nightline, when he is told exactly what he can say and how to say it. And, of course, dresses in well-cut British tweed sports jackets and speaks in a very moderate, understated, American-accented English. And the whole thing is a brilliant performance and is part of the Soviet disinformation apparatus. When Mr. Arbatov, the head of the USA-Canada Institute, is on our airwaves, he is introduced as the head of a think tank that specializes in North American affairs. He is no such thing. That institute was set up by Andropov when he first started running the KGB 16 years ago. And the whole institute, or the majority of its personnel, are KGB or GRU officers, GRU being Soviet military intelligence. It goes for Novosti. The New York Times described Novosti a week ago as a Soviet feature news agency which disseminates Soviet views to the foreign press. Well, that's a rather polite way of putting it. Novosti was also set up by the KGB as a front for the KGB, and the majority of its personnel are KGB or GRU, known to every defector from those services and known to every Western intelligence service. But yet our media will never say that.
Well, it's your contention that our media is being taken in, and also many of our politicians. Is that right?
Absolutely, because where do the politicians, congressmen on Capitol Hill, and I'm there all the time, who shapes their perceptions? Not so much what they hear in open hearings, which are rather badly attended, not by the publication by the U.S. government printing office of these hearings, which they could read during the little leisure time that they have. They very seldom bother to read that. Their perceptions are shaped by the media. And the media has become, over the years, a very powerful instrument of illusion in defiance of basic political, geopolitical, and historical realities. And we document that once again in our latest book, the Monimbo.
The Newsmaker Show from October 21st, 1983. Kevin Doran interviewing Arnaud deBourgrave, the Newsweek editor. Going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll continue to play for you this 1983 interview.
If you're looking for great gift ideas, and who isn't this time of year, why not consider a gift certificate from Wilson Beef Farms? Now, how could you go wrong with a gift like that? Or how about this? A gift bag of Wilson's own beef jerky and snack sticks. Another surefire hit. One of Wilson's gift boxes wrapped in a festive white box with bow. Oh, and did you know that Wilson Beef Farms offers gift baskets filled with spices, marinades, snacks, rubs, and jams? Yet another great gift idea from the good folks at Wilson's. No matter who's on your list, if they have you stumped this Christmas season, Wilson Beef Farms has the answer. A gift bag of snack sticks and jerky, holiday gift box, gift basket, or the always perfect solution, a Wilson Beef Farms gift certificate. Oh, and don't forget to start your holiday meals with the best beef you've ever tasted. Dry-aged beef from Wilson Beef Farms. Drop by their retail store in their one and only location, Hess Road, Canasarega, or call them at 607-545-8308.
We're back on the Newsmaker Show, going back to the year 1983 now, October 21st, 1983. Kevin Doran interviewing Newsweek editor Arnaud deBourgrave.
Mr. deBourgrave, you yourself worked for Newsweek, hardly a conservative journal. You have described yourself on television as a liberal Democrat.
No, I've never said that I was a liberal Democrat. I said that I was a Scoop Jackson Democrat.
Well, okay, I think at least in terms of domestic policy, that would be liberal, I would think.
That's correct.
Okay, well, so you know many of these very people you're talking about who are being taken in, according to you, by the disinformation?
Not just according to me, according to authorities like Dr. Andrei Sakharov, who won, after all, the man who is Russia's leading dissident today and a hero to every liberal in the Western world. Read his political testament in the New York Times Sunday Magazine section, June 8, 1980, which the media did not pick up on, where he warned us about a great many journalists and a great many writers in the Western world busily promoting Soviet expansionist objectives. That is Dr. Andrei Sakharov, not Solzhenitsyn. So don't say Arnaud deBourgrave says all of this. I am quoting to you authorities.
Now, what about Monimbo? What prompted you to write that book?
Well, in summer of 1980, on the first anniversary of the Sandinista Revolution, an extremely important secret conference took place in the Indian barrio of Monimbo, near Masaya, Nicaragua. It was attended by Fidel Castro, his intelligence chiefs, including Manuel Pinheiro Losada, head of the Departamento de America, which specializes in subversion and terrorism in the Western Hemisphere, by Central American revolutionary leaders from El Salvador, Honduras, Costa Rica, and other countries, by the then Minister of National Security from Jamaica, and by a number of visitors from the United States, including some Cuban exiles. The theme of this conference was how to expand the success of the Nicaraguan Revolution, and in particular how to weaken the United States. And it was there in Monimbo, according to one of our sources who was there and who has defected, and we've seen the minutes of the meeting, that Castro boasted that Cuba's agents of influence in the United States were so numerous and so well placed that he had the capability, at a moment of his own choosing, to stage urban chaos and race riots that would make the riots in Miami earlier that year look like a sun shower. And incidentally, Armando Valladares, the Cuban poet and writer who has spent 22 years in Castro's prisons, whose release was negotiated by the President of France last year, has told me that he is absolutely staggered to find out that Castro has more friends in the United States than in Cuba.
So you contend then in this book that Castro has enormous influence in our own country.
Well, Judge Webster knows that. Thousands of agents came in at the time of the Mario boat lift. We're not talking about dozens. We're talking about an estimated 3,000 out of 127,000 refugees that came over at that time. Also 5,000 hardened criminals who were handpicked by the DGI, the Cuban Secret Service, to add to what they call the social decomposition of the United States. That is Marx's phraseology for social decay. And what did these hardened criminals do in the city of Miami? They doubled the crime rate in a one-year period. So from Castro's standpoint, it was a beautiful operation. In fact, Castro, to his intimates, has referred to that Mariel boat lift as another Pearl Harbor for the United States, even more important than the first one because they didn't even realize what was happening to them.
What about the drug situation? Don't you maintain in the book now that the Cubans control pretty much the drug trade in this country?
Well, again, Kevin, I think that is a function of how brilliantly the media has performed in suppressing certain inconvenient facts. We had a federal jury trial in the city of Miami for 3 weeks last February with the Cuban drug connection, the direct connection between the Cuban Secret Service, the DGI, and some of our bigger drug rackets in Dade County, proved beyond the shadow of a legal doubt. 4 high-ranking Cuban officials were indicted by our federal government in November of 1982, including the head of their Navy, Admiral Santa Maria. That did make a few paragraphs in our papers. The trial itself, you won't find it in our major media outlets except for the Miami Herald. Thomas Enders, Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs at the time, now Ambassador to Madrid, testified before 2 Senate committees in February and March of last year on the Cuban drug connection with names and dates and places, and he was totally ignored by our media. So what on earth is going on? Because if this had been the right-wing dictator of Chile, Mr. Pinochet, or Mr. Marcos of the Philippines, or President Chun of South Korea, and their secret services involved in our drug rackets in this country to buy arms, to finance terrorists against our own interests in Central and in South America, I can guarantee you that that would have been banner headlines not just for one day, but for months on end.
Why is it? Are you suggesting that the members of the American media are consciously denying us this information, or is it their mindset?
The editor of the Washington Post was called about the original announcement in Miami in January of 1982 when Robert Moss and I were working on the Cuban drug connection. We'd been researching and reporting it down there. Then suddenly, the U.S. Attorney, Atlee Wampler at the time, gave a press conference and said that for the first time in history, this would be proved in open judicial proceedings. And banner headlines in the Miami Herald the next day, not a word in the Washington Post, but we know that Ben Bradley was called every day for 6 consecutive days to bring it to his attention. And it still didn't get into the Post.
You know Ben Bradley. How would you explain that?
I think it's Ben Bradley went to Cuba. He knows Castro. Barbara Walters has been down there. Many media stars have been down there. And they all come back under his charm, under his spell. And admittedly, Castro is a devastatingly charming man with tremendous charisma. But that doesn't mean that he's telling you the truth.
What about the peace movement? Now, 40 miles from here tomorrow, there will be 5,000 people out demonstrating against American nuclear weapons. What is your view on the peace movement? Who's controlling that?
Well, the peace movement, I respect the millions of people who are out there demonstrating for a freeze and for peace. These are very laudable sentiments. What I do not understand is why we are not told what the Europeans have been told by their media, and that is the degree of manipulation by the World Peace Council and its offshoots, national offshoots like the U.S. Peace Council. It has 137 branches all over the world, and other Communist Front organizations that are heavily involved in the peace movement and coordinate things on both sides of the Atlantic. There was a long piece about it on page 38 of yesterday's Wall Street Journal. It's amazing that last year, when all of this evidence came out in congressional testimony, the only thing that we could find in the media was Senator Boland's statement that after these hearings, they had heard no evidence of direct Soviet control of the peace movement. Well, of course there's no direct Soviet control. It is indirect. They shuffled the cards to such a degree that it is very difficult to pin it down, or at least pin it down in a court of law. But every intelligence service in the Western world knows what's going on. And President Mitterrand of France expelled 47 Soviet spies last February, and he was just appalled to discover to what degree they were directly involved in trying to promote the French peace movement, which, as you know, has been lagging behind the others. And in West Germany, the defense minister under Chancellor Schmidt's Socialist Coalition, Hans Appel, said in Parliament a year and a half ago that much of the funding and the political infrastructure of the West German pacifist movement was coming from the East. As President Mitterrand himself said, where were all these people when the Soviets were deploying one SS-20 every week, targeted against Western Europe for the last 5 or 6 years?
Mr. deBourgrave, we're down to the last minute. Two things. If you made these allegations 20 years ago, 30 years ago, there would be all kinds of congressional investigations. There are not now. Why not? And secondly, what's to be done?
What's to be done is the last thing we want to do is a McCarthy-type witch hunt. But we do want to enlighten public opinion as to what is going on and how hostile intelligence services operate within our society to paralyze us and make sure that they can defeat us without having to fight us.
Our time is up. Thank you very much.
This is WLEA, Hornell, New York.